Captain Elara Hayes stood by the observation window of the Arcadia, her eyes fixed on the glowing orb below. The planet Caleria, once home to an advanced and thriving civilization, now lay in ruins. The Arcadia had been sent on a routine exploration mission to chart unmarked planets in the outer reaches of the galaxy, but what they had found here was far beyond anything they could have imagined. The Calerians had once been masters of organic technology, using bioengineered plants and animals to create harmony in their world. Their cities had grown like living organisms, their buildings formed from symbiotic plants and structures that breathe with life. But those days were long gone. Now, the planet was barren. Its cities were abandoned, their streets empty, and the once beautiful biotech had deteriorated into decaying ruins. The team of scientists and explorers had landed a few hours ago, but the reality of the Calerian downfall was setting in. Captain Hayes felt a knot in her stomach as she surveyed the world below. The Calerians, a peaceful species known for their dedication to ecological balance, had once been seen as an ideal partner for the galactic community. Yet they had been ignored, abandoned by the very civilizations they had tried to help. As Hayes made her way to the bridge, the ship's communications officer, Lieutenant Amir, greeted her with a concerned look. "Captain, we've found something. Something strange." "What is it, Lieutenant?" Hayes asked, her voice calm but laced with curiosity. Amir turned to the screen, which now displayed a set of ancient ruins half buried beneath the planet's surface. But it wasn't the ruins that caught Hayes' attention. It was the movement. A small group of Calerians, dressed in ragged clothes and barely surviving, was spotted scavenging what little was left of their city. "There are survivors," Amir said. "Captain, this is more than just abandoned ruins. There are people down there." Hayes' heart skipped a beat. She had expected nothing but history, the remnants of a fallen civilization. But this was something different. The Calerians weren't just forgotten. They were living in the shadows of their once glorious past, struggling to survive. "Prepare a landing party," Hayes ordered. "We need to make contact. There's no time to waste." As the Arcadia touched down on the surface of Caleria, Hayes felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread. She had read the reports about the Calerians, how they had been ignored by the galactic powers, their technology stolen, their culture mocked. The Calerians had never been conquerors or fighters. Their strength lay in peace, in balance, but that had been their downfall. Their refusal to conform to the violent ways of the galaxy had left them vulnerable. The landing team, including Lieutenant Amir, scientist Dr. Leah Chen, and 2 security officers, disembarked from the ship. The air on Caleria was thin and cold, but the most striking feature was the silence. There was no hum of technology, no chirp of wildlife, just the eerie quiet of a world that had once been full of life. The group moved cautiously through the ruins, their boots crunching on the brittle ground. It wasn't long before they spotted the survivors. 3 Calerians huddled together near a fallen structure, looking up with wide eyes as the humans approached. They appeared frail, their once vibrant green skin now dull and covered in patches of decay. But their eyes, those eyes were still filled with a spark of life. Dr. Chen, the biologist, was the first to speak. She knelt down and extended her hand. "We mean no harm," she said softly in their language, hoping the Calerians would understand. One of the Calerians, a tall figure with silver hair and delicate features, stepped forward cautiously. She looked from the human to the ground, then back up. Her voice was weak, but her words were clear. "You are the first to come." Captain Hayes watched the exchange, her mind racing. "We are here to help," she said in the universal translator's neutral tone. "We can offer you food, shelter, and a chance to rebuild." The Calerian woman's eyes flickered with skepticism. "Help? Why now? Why after all this time?" Hayes took a deep breath. "Because we cannot stand by and watch you suffer. We know what has happened to your people, and we will not turn our backs on you." The Calerians exchanged looks, their faces a mix of hope and disbelief. For so long they had been forgotten by the galaxy, left to fade into the shadows of history. But now, here were humans, united and determined, offering not just aid, but a promise. "This is just the beginning," Captain Hayes said quietly, watching as the Calirians slowly approached the humans. "We will not let you be abandoned again." As the first rays of the planet's sun broke through the misty atmosphere, a fragile alliance began to form, a bond between two civilizations that had once seemed so different, now united by a common goal: to rebuild and protect what had been lost. Captain Elara Hayes sat in the small conference room aboard the Arcadia, a cup of hot tea in hand, watching the Calirians on the other side of the table. The survivors from the landing party had been brought aboard the ship, where they could be treated with medical supplies and given some comfort. The Calirians, though still skeptical, had slowly warmed up to the humans. The Calirian woman who had spoken earlier, now introduced as Talira, sat with her hands clasped tightly on her lap. She had an air of dignity despite the clear signs of exhaustion and hardship. Beside her was her companion, a younger male named Derek, who looked around with wide eyes, still unsure about these strange humans. Dr. Leah Chen, the biologist who had spent hours talking with them, stood at the front of the room, her datapad open, ready to translate any further details Talira would share. "We're here to listen," Hayes said, looking directly at Talira. "We want to know what happened to your people. We want to understand." Talira's eyes glistened as she looked up. The words seemed to hang in the air for a long moment before she spoke. "Our people were once mighty. We Calirians were peaceful, yes, but we were also powerful in ways others could not understand. We knew how to make our world thrive, how to balance nature with technology. Our cities grew like living things. Our buildings were made from plants that healed the land. Our technology connected to the very essence of life." Hayes leaned forward, intrigued. "You were able to combine biology with technology?" she asked. Talira nodded. "We could make plants that purified the air and water. Our fields could grow crops without harming the soil. We healed the planet, and it healed us in return. But the galaxy didn't understand. They didn't see what we could offer." Derek, sitting quietly beside her, looked down. "They wanted to use us. At first, they came for our knowledge. The galactic powers came to us, asking for our help. But when we refused to fight their wars, when we wouldn't share our more dangerous technologies, they turned away. They abandoned us." A heavy silence settled over the room. Hayes could feel the weight of their words, a story that had been hidden for so long, now finally being shared. "Who turned away?" Dr. Chen asked softly, leaning forward. "What happened to your people?" Talira's voice faltered for a moment. "The Zerak Dominion was the first to reject us. They said we were too soft, too weak. They wanted our knowledge of biological weapons, but we refused. We knew how destructive that could be. We tried to warn them about the consequences, but they didn't listen." "The Zerak are a ruthless race," Hayes said, her tone hardening. "They have no respect for life unless it serves their purpose." Talira nodded. "They wiped out many of our colonies. The ones that survived, like ours, were left to fend for ourselves. We were too small, too peaceful, and too different. Over time, other civilizations followed the Zerek's lead. They ignored us. They saw no use in a race that valued life over conquest." Hayes felt a deep sense of anger rise within her. The Calirians had been abandoned by the very races that should have helped them, left to fade into nothing. She glanced at Lieutenant Amir, who stood quietly by the door, his expression filled with quiet fury. Dr. Chen continued her questions. "Did anyone else try to help you?" Talira's eyes darkened. "There were a few who came. Some smaller races tried to offer aid, but they were too weak. The Galactic Council turned a blind eye, and we had no power to stop what was happening." Derek finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some of us tried to fight back. We built weapons, but we weren't soldiers. We lost everything. Our homes, our families. Your people were caught in the middle, Hayes said softly. Caught between those who wanted to use you and those who didn't care. Talira nodded slowly, her face etched with sorrow. We knew the danger. We understood that our technology, our peaceful ways, were a threat to those who lived by power and control. And yet, we never gave up hope. Hayes could see the pain in Talira's eyes, but also a flicker of something else, a spark of resilience. This wasn't just a tale of loss. It was a story of survival. Despite everything, the Calirians had held on. We may have lost our cities, our homes, Talira continued, but we have not lost who we are. We are Calirians. We are survivors. The words hung in the air, and Hayes couldn't help but feel a deep respect for these people. They had been crushed by the weight of a galaxy that didn't care, but they had endured. They had lived. Then we'll help you rebuild, Captain Hayes said, her voice steady. We won't turn away. The Terran Alliance stands with you. Talira's eyes filled with tears, but she held her head high. Thank you, Captain. Perhaps there is hope for us after all. As the meeting concluded, Hayes sat back in her chair, her mind racing with plans and ideas. The Calirians were more than just a lost race. They were a people with knowledge, culture, and strength. If humanity could help them rebuild, they would create something truly powerful, something the galaxy had never seen before. And this time, they wouldn't be forgotten. Back on Earth, the situation was tense. Captain Ilara Hayes stood in the central command room of the United Terran Alliance's military headquarters, her face illuminated by the large display screens that covered the walls. The room buzzed with activity as officers and representatives from various sectors discussed urgent matters. Captain Hayes, Admiral Ethan Burns said, turning from a group of officers, I have to be blunt with you. What you're asking for is risky. Our resources are stretched thin, and the Galactic Council is going to have questions. You're proposing we take action on a planet no one has cared about for centuries. Why should we put ourselves in danger? Hayes looked directly at him, her voice steady. Because we cannot ignore what has happened to the Calirians. Their people were abandoned, and now they are our responsibility. If we don't help them, then who will? Byrne narrowed his eyes. I'm not disputing that what happened to them is tragic. But this isn't about charity, Ilara. You're asking us to take on the Zirek Dominion, and the Galactic Council won't support us. They see the Calirians as weak, as a lost cause. Why would we risk war for them? The room fell silent. Hayes felt the weight of those words, but she couldn't back down. The Calirians weren't just a lost cause. They were a living, breathing culture that had been systematically destroyed by those who didn't care to understand them. And now, the Calirians had reached out to humanity for help. It was up to Earth to answer that call. Because we're not the same as the other powers in the galaxy, Hayes said, her voice growing stronger. We're humans. We don't turn our backs on those in need. We protect the innocent. If we let the Zirek and others have their way, we become complicit in their destruction. Is that who we want to be? Admiral Burns studied her for a moment. You're not going to let this go, are you? No, Hayes replied firmly. I'm not. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Some of the officers exchanged uncertain glances, but many seemed to share Hayes's conviction. It was a difficult decision, but the right one. After a long pause, Burns sighed, leaning back in his chair. Fine, he said. We'll do it, but this isn't going to be easy. We'll need to move quietly, build a case to the Council, and prepare for the Zirek's inevitable reaction. I'll gather the necessary support, but we'll have to keep this under the radar. Hayes nodded. Understood. We'll make sure everything is ready. With the decision made, the wheels were set in motion. Hayes returned to the Arcadia, where she immediately began organizing a covert operation. The plan was simple. Send a small fleet of ships, along with engineers, medical teams, and diplomatic personnel, to Caliria. The goal was not just to help the Calirians survive, but to help them thrive once again. In the following weeks, Earth's resources poured into the mission. Engineers worked around the clock, adapting human technology to complement the Calirians' unique biotech. Medical teams prepared to help the survivors heal from years of neglect, and diplomats began crafting a message to the Galactic Council, one that would push for the recognition of the Calirians as a legitimate and valuable species. As the fleet readied for departure, a meeting was scheduled with the United Terran Alliance's most senior officials. Hayes stood before the council, presenting the mission and its importance. The room was filled with politicians, military leaders, and experts from across the Earth's various sectors. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes began, "we stand at a crossroads. We can choose to ignore the Calirians, to let them fall further into obscurity, or we can take a stand. The choice we make here will define who we are as humans." She continued, speaking with unwavering conviction. "The Calirians have been abandoned for too long. They have the potential to contribute greatly to our galaxy. If we help them rebuild, it is not just our responsibility. It is our opportunity to show the galaxy that humanity values life, not just power." The room was quiet. Some council members shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of taking on the responsibility. Others seemed to be considering it carefully. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a voice spoke up. "I agree with Captain Hayes," said Ambassador Juno Maris, a well-respected diplomat from the Terran Alliance. "This is not just a matter of helping a species in need. It's a matter of protecting our values. If we turn our backs on the Calirians, we send a message to the rest of the galaxy that we will only care for those who can offer something in return. That's not who we are." The room buzzed with conversation, and after a few moments of debate, the decision was made. The mission would go forward. As Hayes left the council chambers, she felt a wave of relief. The path ahead was uncertain and dangerous, but Earth had made its choice. They would protect the Calirians, no matter the cost. Back aboard the Arcadia, preparations were in full swing. Supplies were loaded, and the fleet began its journey back to Caliria. As the ships launched from Earth's orbit, Captain Hayes stood on the bridge, looking out at the stars. "This is just the beginning," she whispered to herself. "We will not let them fall again." And with that, the fleet set course for Caliria, the future of an entire species now tied to humanity's decision. It would be a difficult journey, but one that could change the course of the galaxy forever. The Arcadia finally arrived at Caliria after weeks of travel, and the crew was ready to begin their mission. The planet, once thriving with life, was now a shadow of its former self. The cities were crumbling, and the landscape was scarred from years of neglect. Yet, the most noticeable change was in the Calirians themselves. The survivors, though weak and weary, held on to hope that humanity's arrival might mark the beginning of something better. Captain Ilara Hayes stood on the bridge, her eyes scanning the planet below. The fleet was already in orbit, and they had begun their descent to the surface. "All teams, report," she said, her voice steady. "We have one chance to make a difference." Lieutenant Amir, standing by her side, nodded. "Engineering teams are prepared to begin restoring the biotech systems. Medical units are ready to assist the Calirians with their health needs. The first group of diplomats is meeting with Talira and the others." Hayes smiled faintly. It was a delicate balance. The Calirians were welcoming, but they were also cautious. After years of abandonment, trusting outsiders, especially a species as young as humanity, was not easy. But Hayes was determined. She couldn't let them down. The first days on Caliria were filled with challenges. The Calirians had lived for so long without support that their systems had started to fail. Crops no longer grew as they once had, and their ability to maintain their once grand cities was long gone. The Arcadia's engineers immediately began working on the biotech systems, using both human and Calirian knowledge to find solutions. It was a difficult process. Working with living technology was not something most humans had ever done before, but they were determined to succeed. Dr. Leah Chen, the biologist, worked alongside Calirian scientists, eager to share knowledge. They spent hours in the ruins of ancient labs, poring over old texts and trying to piece together how the Calirians' once remarkable systems had functioned. There was much to learn, and the human scientists were eager to collaborate. But there was also a deep respect for the Calirians' ancient wisdom. One afternoon, Dr. Chen stood in front of a large structure that had once been a grand research facility, now half buried under layers of dust and debris. "This could be the key to restoring the planet's ecosystem," she said, her eyes scanning the blueprints on her datavat. "If we can reactivate the energy source here, it might help power the biotech again." Talira approached, her face a mixture of hope and doubt. "You really think it's possible?" Dr. Chen smiled. "It's not going to be easy, but we've seen how resilient your people are. If anyone can make this work, it's you." Talira nodded slowly. "We have no choice but to try. But it's not just the technology we need to restore, it's the spirit of our people." That night, a meeting was held with the Calirian leaders, including Talira, Derek, and a few others. They had gathered in a small, makeshift council room, created with the help of human engineers. The walls were lined with monitors displaying progress updates on the restoration efforts. "We have to start with the basics," Captain Hayes said, her voice filled with determination. "We need to rebuild your agriculture and your homes. The technology you once had can still work, but it's going to take time. The most important thing is to restore the faith of your people." Talira nodded, though her eyes looked weary. "Our people have been broken. The Zirak did more than destroy our cities. They crushed our spirit. How do we rebuild that?" Derek, who had remained silent for most of the meeting, spoke up. "By showing them that we are not alone. The humans have come. They are helping us. We must prove that we are worthy of their trust." Captain Hayes leaned forward, her gaze steady. "You've already proven that. You survived. And now, we work together to make sure you thrive again." The following days were filled with hard work. The engineers and Calirian scientists worked tirelessly to restore the planet's biotech systems. Dr. Chen and her team continued to work with Calirian medical experts, helping heal the survivors from the effects of years of neglect. The first signs of progress came slowly but surely. A small farm, once abandoned, now began to show signs of life again as human and Calirian techniques combined to help it grow. In the evenings, the human and Calirian teams would gather around makeshift campfires, sharing stories, learning from each other, and strengthening the bonds between their peoples. It was a slow process, but every day, the Calirians began to regain a sense of hope. They could see the changes happening on their planet, and they could feel their spirits lifting. Captain Hayes stood on a hill overlooking a field that was once barren. Now, new crops had begun to sprout from the ground, thanks to the combined efforts of humans and Calirians. Talira stood beside her, a quiet smile on her face. "This is just the beginning," Talira said softly. "Yes," Hayes agreed, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "But it's a good beginning. Together, we can restore what was lost." As the sun began to set over the planet, the two women stood side by side, watching the first signs of recovery in a world that had once been forgotten. There was still much work to be done, but they knew they weren't alone. The Calirians had found hope again, and humanity had found its purpose. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, the future of Caliria seemed brighter. The days on Caliria grew longer, and the work of restoration continued at a steady pace. Captain Ilara Hayes and her team were slowly rebuilding the planet's biotech systems, and the Calirians, once again, began to find hope. Crops grew where there had been only dust, and the ruins of ancient cities began to show signs of life. Yet, beneath the surface, there was an unsettling feeling in the air. The quiet hum of progress was being overshadowed by something much darker. One morning, as Hayes stood on the bridge of the Arcadia, Lieutenant Amir walked in with a troubled expression. He had a data tablet in his hand, and his eyes were filled with concern. "Captain," Amir said, his voice low, "we've intercepted a transmission. It's from the Zirak Dominion. Hayes' heart sank. The Zirak were the last people she wanted to hear from. What do they want? Amir glanced at the screen, his expression hardening. They're sending a fleet. They've learned of our involvement with the Calirians. They want us to leave. Hayes took a deep breath, steadying herself. They can't just. I know, Amir interrupted, but they're not asking. They're threatening. The transmission flickered on the screen. A Zirak commander, his reptilian eyes glaring through the holographic display, spoke with cold authority. Human forces, this is Commander Carr of the Zirak Dominion. You have no place on Caliria. Leave immediately, or you will face the consequences. Your actions have not gone unnoticed, and we will not allow you to interfere with the natural order. Hayes clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. I'm not leaving. We've made a promise to the Calirians. We're staying. Amir nodded, but his face showed the concern that weighed on him. This isn't going to be easy, Captain. The Zirak have a powerful fleet. If they choose to attack, we'll be outnumbered. Captain Hayes turned to the strategic screen, her mind racing. The Zirak were known for their ruthless military might, and they had been a significant force in the galaxy for centuries. They didn't tolerate defiance, especially from races they considered insignificant. She knew the risks, but she couldn't back down. Not now. We'll prepare, Hayes said firmly. Get me a full report on their fleet movements. I want to know everything. As Amir left to carry out her orders, Hayes turned her attention to the diplomatic teams. They were still working with the Calirian leaders to ensure their cooperation and strengthen their resolve. She couldn't risk a war breaking out, not when so much progress had been made. That afternoon, Halira and her fellow Calirians arrived at the Arcadia for a meeting with the humans. Their faces were grim, and Hayes could see the worry in their eyes. The Calirians had been through so much, and now they feared that their fragile hope would be crushed before it even had a chance to grow. We've heard about the Zirak, Talira said quietly. What are we going to do? Captain Hayes met her gaze, her expression calm but firm. We're not going anywhere. We made a promise, Talira. We're staying, and we're going to make sure the Zirak know that. Darek, who had grown more confident in the weeks since the arrival of the humans, spoke up. If the Zirak come, we will fight. We fought before, and we will fight again. We won't let them take everything from us. Hayes smiled at the fire in his eyes. The Calirians were not helpless. They were survivors, and they would fight to protect what they had left. But they needed support, and that's where humanity came in. We're going to do everything we can to make sure you're ready, Hayes said. But we also need your help. If we're going to stand against the Zirak, we need to work together. The days that followed were filled with preparation. The Arcadia and the Calirian forces worked tirelessly to strengthen their defenses. Human engineers worked with the Calirians to fortify their cities and activate old defense systems. Meanwhile, the fleet's combat teams began training the Calirians in basic tactics, though they knew it would take time to make them a formidable force. Dr. Leah Chen and the medical teams continued their work, but even she could sense the rising tension. The Zirak were coming, and there was little time left. Finally, the day arrived. The Arcadia detected an incoming fleet of Zirak ships, massive warships that blotted out the stars as they approached Caliria. The crew on board the Arcadia worked quickly, making sure the ship's weapons were ready, but Captain Hayes knew that they couldn't face the Zirak alone. She was counting on the Calirians to help them fight. As the Zirak fleet entered the system, Hayes stood on the bridge, watching the screen with a determined gaze. The Calirians had never faced an enemy like the Zirak, but they weren't going to back down. Humanity wouldn't let them. This is it, Hayes said quietly. We stand together, or we fall alone. The first shots rang out across the sky, and the battle for Caliria began. The Zirak fleet descended on Caliria like a storm, their massive ships blocking out the stars as they entered the planet's orbit. The first wave of battle cruisers approached the planet with terrifying speed. Captain Ilara Hayes stood at the center of the bridge aboard the Arcadia, her gaze locked on the screen before her, eyes sharp and focused. "Prepare for engagement," Hayes ordered, her voice calm but filled with authority. "All hands, brace for battle. We will hold the line." Her crew moved quickly, following the instructions with military precision. The ship's weapon systems hummed to life as Lieutenant Amir worked furiously at the controls, coordinating with the Calirian defense teams who had joined the Arcadia's forces. On the surface of Caliria, the Calirian forces were preparing their own defenses. The human engineers had worked relentlessly to reactivate the planet's ancient defense mechanisms, and though the Calirians were new to combat, in the face of a powerful enemy like the Zirak, their determination was unmatched. Talira stood among her people, her face hard with resolve. The Zirak were ruthless, but the Calirians had endured countless trials in the past. Now, with the help of their human allies, they would face this new challenge together. "We fight for our future," Talira said to her people, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "We will not let them take Caliria from us." Around her, the Calirians nodded, their faces filled with fierce determination. They were ready to defend their world, no matter the odds. Back on the Arcadia, the battle had already begun. The Zyric ships unleashed a barrage of energy blasts toward the planet, and the Arcadia returned fire, its cannons sending beams of light across the void. The first wave of Zyric warships retaliated, their shields flaring with each hit, but the humans and Calirians fought together, with skill and coordination. Lieutenant Amir worked with the ship's weapons officer, directing fire to the Zyric flagship, a colossal vessel bristling with weaponry. "Target their weak points," he said, his hands moving swiftly across the control panel. "We need to take them down before they can land troops." The Arcadia fired another blast, hitting the Zyric flagship's shields. The ship groaned under the impact, but it held. In the distance, a fleet of smaller Zyric ships began deploying troops toward Caliria's surface, their drop pods plummeting through the atmosphere. Captain Hayes watched the unfolding battle on the screen, her mind racing. They were outnumbered, but she had faith in her crew, in the Calirians, and in humanity's determination to protect the innocent. "Admiral Byrne, do we have backup?" Hayes asked, her voice tight with concern. Byrne's image appeared on the comm screen. "We're working on it, Ilara. The rest of the fleet is on the way, but it'll take some time to reach you. You have to hold out a little longer." "Understood," Hayes replied. "We'll buy you that time." Down on the surface, the Calirians and humans fought side by side. The ancient defense systems had come online, and energy shields began to envelop key cities, protecting them from the barrage of enemy fire. The Calirians fought with a newfound strength, their long-dormant warrior spirit reawakened by the sight of their world being defended once more. Derek, leading a group of Calirian soldiers, gave orders to activate the city's shield generators. As the energy barrier flared to life, he looked up at the sky, where the first Zyric drop pods began to fall. They were coming. "We have to hold the line," Derek said, his voice steady. "For Caliria." The sound of explosions echoed in the distance as the Calirian defense forces clashed with the Zyric invaders. Human soldiers, armed with advanced weapons, fought alongside the Calirians, creating a united front against the overwhelming enemy. Back in space, the battle was reaching its peak. The Arcadia fought fiercely, evading enemy fire as it returned strike after strike. The Zyric fleet, though large and powerful, had underestimated the resolve of humanity and the Calirians. "We've got them on the ropes," Lieutenant Amir said, his voice filled with a mix of excitement and tension. "One more push, and we can disable their fleet." Hayes nodded, her eyes locked on the screen. "Give them everything we've got." The Arcadia fired its full arsenal in a single devastating strike, hitting the Zyric flagship's exposed weak point. The flagship's shields collapsed, and a massive explosion erupted in space. The ship began to break apart, its massive hull splintering as debris rained down toward the planet. With the flagship destroyed, the Zirek fleet faltered. The remaining ships were quickly overwhelmed by the combined forces of the humans and Calirians, who fought with an unbreakable bond of unity. On the surface, the battle continued as the Calirians and their allies pushed the remaining Zirek forces back. The Calirians had proven their strength, and with the help of the humans, they were reclaiming their world. After what seemed like hours, the Zirek forces began to retreat, their remaining ships abandoning the battle as they fled into the depths of space. The Calirians had won. Captain Hayes stood on the bridge of the Arcadia, watching as the last of the enemy ships disappeared into the distance. She felt a sense of relief wash over her, but she knew that this battle was only the beginning. "We did it," Amir said, turning to Hayes with a smile. Hayes nodded, but her expression was thoughtful. "This victory is only the start. We've shown the galaxy what humanity is capable of. Now we have to make sure the Calirians never face this threat again." With the battle over, the Arcadia's crew and the Calirians began to regroup. They had won the day, but the fight for the future of Caliria was far from over. The aftermath of the battle left the planet of Caliria forever changed. The once threatening Zirek fleet had been driven off, but the scars of the conflict remained. Captain Ilara Hayes stood on the bridge of the Arcadia, watching as the last remnants of the Zirek forces disappeared into the far reaches of space. The battle had been won, but the war for Caliria's future was far from over. The Calirian people, once devastated by years of neglect and invasion, now stood on the cusp of a new era. Their world had been saved, but they knew that rebuilding would be a long and difficult process. It would take more than just the victory over the Zirek to restore the planet to its former glory. Hayes turned to Lieutenant Amir, who was working alongside the communications officer. "Any word from the fleet?" she asked. Amir glanced up from his console, his eyes scanning the readout. "Admiral Byrne reports that reinforcements are on their way. They'll be here in a few hours. They're bringing supplies and additional resources to help with the recovery efforts." Hayes nodded, relieved but still focused. "Good. We'll need all the help we can get." On the surface of Caliria, the Calirians had already begun the process of rebuilding. The Calirian defense forces, along with the human soldiers, worked side by side, repairing damaged cities, reactivating vital infrastructure, and restoring the biosystems that had once sustained their planet. It was a slow process, but every day brought new signs of progress. Talira and Derek, the Calirian leaders, had become symbols of resilience. They stood tall, guiding their people through the difficult task of rebuilding not just their homes, but their spirit. For the first time in years, the Calirians dared to hope for a future where they were no longer at the mercy of the galaxy's most powerful and dangerous forces. "This is our chance," Talira said as she met with Captain Hayes in the command center of the Arcadia. "We can rebuild everything, the cities, the crops, the technology. But we can't rebuild the trust we lost in others. How do we make sure that no one will ever abandon us again?" Hayes met her gaze, her expression steady. "The galaxy is full of dangers, Talira, but you're not alone anymore. You have us. And together, we'll make sure no one ever dares to forget about Caliria again." It was a promise that both women knew would not be easy to keep, but it was a promise worth making. As the days passed, the Calirians and humans continued their work. The Calirian people were learning quickly, using their ancient knowledge combined with human technology to advance their recovery. It wasn't just about restoring what had been lost. It was about building a stronger future, one where they could defend themselves, protect their home, and thrive once more. On the Arcadia, Captain Hayes watched the progress reports come in. It was hard not to feel a sense of pride in what they had accomplished. The fight was not yet over, but the first steps toward a better future had been taken. The Zirek were gone, and Caliria was free. But there was still much to do. Hayes knew the importance of forging strong alliances. She had seen firsthand how a united front could change the course of history. As the Arcadia prepared for its next mission, Hayes sent a message to the leaders of other galactic civilizations, including the Federation and the halls of the Silurian Order. They had to be made aware of Caliria's recovery. If they were to ensure lasting peace for the Calirians, they needed the support of the galaxy's other powers. "Captain, I just received a message from the Federation," Lieutenant Amir said, bringing up a communication window on the screen. "They're offering their full support for Caliria's recovery." Hayes smiled faintly. "It's a start. Let's make sure this is just the beginning." Back on Caliria, the Calirians had begun to rebuild their great libraries and research centers, eager to reclaim the knowledge that had been lost. They were determined to never again fall into the trap of forgetting their past. Knowledge would be their strength, and with humanity by their side, they would make sure their future was secure. As Talira stood overlooking the newly rebuilt city, her heart swelled with pride. The lights of the city twinkled in the distance, a beacon of hope in the darkness. For so long, the Calirians had been isolated, abandoned, and forgotten. But now, with the help of their human allies, they were rising once more. "We will rebuild," Talira said quietly to herself, "and we will thrive." As she turned to face the horizon, the rising sun bathed Caliria in its warm golden light. It was the dawn of a new day, not just for Caliria, but for all the civilizations that would come together to ensure that no one would ever again be abandoned or left to suffer in the dark corners of space. The battle for Caliria had been won, but the true victory lay in the promise of a better future, one where humanity and the Calirians would stand together, united, stronger than ever before.